Okay, I've started recording.
Thanks, Hanta. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin by thanking you all for making time to joining us. It's never easy to create time for this kind of engagements, so we must really appreciate your efforts. We must also greatly appreciate our presenters. Um, who also make time to talk to us. Right, so we have circulated part one of the roster for our presentations for 2022. Fortunately, that part of the schedule is almost full, but we still have space for the second semester. So please feel free to volunteer to give a talk if you have something to share, if you are keen on sharing something, ongoing research, etc. You can also suggest or invite speakers. We still have space for especially the second semester. Right, so our presenter for today is our very own Hanta Henning.
Hello.
Hanta is a lecturer in the Okay, I was just introducing Hanta as a lecturer in the Department of English here at the University of the Free State, and she teaches in the fields of linguistics and cultural studies. She is currently pursuing her PhD with her research focusing on representations of the adoption triangle in South African adoption narratives. Her research interests further include semantic and cognitive affective mapping, trauma and resilience theory, double consciousness, celebrity adoption, and humanitarianism. She also studies the memoir. She is also a very prolific writer, and her collection of poetry, Speech Therapy, it also has an Afrikaans version, was published in 2021. Right, so Hanta will talk to us about unreal mothers, adoption, legitimate mothering, and Fiela's child by Dalene Matthee. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Hanta, it's all yours. We will listen to you, and after your presentation, we will open the floor for questions, comments, and criticisms. Hanta.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, I have to open with a caveat. It's no secret that South Africa's history is riddled with racial discrimination, segregation, and racial labeling. In Dalene Matthee's novel Fiela's Child, the character of Fiela is classified as colored, and I am intensely aware how problematic this term is. Many individuals who are identified as colored are descended from the Khoisan people who originally inhabited the western parts of South Africa, from Asian and African slaves brought to the Cape from the earliest years of the colony, and from European settlers and other Africans. So labeling these individuals as colored or mixed race placed them in a grey zone where they were socially more acceptable than black individuals, while simultaneously not being afforded the same rights and privileges as white people. Today, still, the use of both the terms colored and mixed race is contested due to South Africa's history of racial labeling and segregation. However, As the term is used in the novel, and since I could find no alternative name that had been coined for these people, I do use the term colored in this paper. In the Knysna forest, Elias and Bartha van Rooyen's son Lucas goes missing on a particularly foggy day. After days and weeks of searching, no trace of the boy is found. Around the same time, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed 3-year-old boy is abandoned in the Long Kloof in the Tankwa Karoo, a semi-arid region in South Africa. He is found by the colored woman Fiela on the doorstep of her isolated farmhouse. Fiela and Seling Kumuti take in the child, who they call Benjamin, and raises him as their own, effectively adopting him. 7 years later, white census takers arrive at Fiela's farm, Wolvekraal. Fiela, intensely aware that it is considered a crime for a colored woman to raise a white child, sends Benjamin away to play while she talks to the census takers. However, Benjamin returns to her home where the census takers see him. This sets off a chain of events that leads to disruption, displacement, anguish, and identity crises. The census takers return weeks later. Benjamin has to come with them to Knysna. Bartha and Elias van Rooyen need to ascertain whether he is their missing son, Lucas. Bartha van Rooyen does end up identifying him as her long-lost son, and the boy, now called Lucas, is ordered by the magistrate to return to his family in the forest, where he lives for many years. The question of how a boy of 3 could traverse the dangerous mountains between Knysna and the Long Kloof, a journey which would have taken several days, barefoot and alone, is never answered, though it is one continually voiced by both Fiela and Bartha. Though Fiela's child is not one typically classified as an adoption narrative, I argue that we can see this novel as one. After all, the child Benjamin is not Fiela and Seling Kumuti's biological child, but he is raised as one. Neither is Lucas, Elias and Bartha van Rooyen's biological child, yet he is similarly adopted into their family. What is salient in this novel is that the normative interracial adoptive modus, where white parents adopt black or mixed-race children, is initially inverted, with a colored family adopting a white child. In addition, a further level of political and racial inequality is added to the discourse. Set in South Africa during the time of British colonization in the 19th century, the novel does not only foreground the dominant white, marginalized black discourse, but also the pressures and limitation on all South Africans under British rule, changing the white-black hierarchy to privileged, normative English on the forefront, followed by Dutch and Afrikaans white, and finally black and colored peoples. Not only does Fiela need to contend with her crime of raising a white child, she is also faced with a Dutch Afrikaans white legal system desperately trying to both cling to its roots and urgently trying to comply with British imperial expectations, systems, and norms. At the same time, same-race adoption, with the white Van Rooyen family adopting Lucas, is brought into play. It is in the juxtaposition between the inverted normative interracial adoption modus and the same-race adoption modus that we are able to explore the concepts of mothering and othering, and indeed real and unreal mothering. Further, it is important to consider how mothering is classed and racialized with specific reference to the novel. This seems a very circuitous route to arrive at the question under discussion. However, the contextualization I provided is essential in understanding the questions I will grapple with in this paper. Adoptive mothers are routinely asked, and I draw here on my own lived experience, are you the child's real mother? This seemingly simple question begets other questions in turn. What does being a real mother entail? Does the existence of a real mother imply the presence of its opposite, an unreal or imagined mother? And if adopted mothers are not real mothers, are they then imagined mothers? And what is real? In an attempt to analyze, if not answer these questions, I will discuss the concepts of legitimate mothering by drawing on the concepts of biological privilege and pronatalism. Specifically, I will look at how adoption troubles these concepts by referring to stereotypes and representations of adoptive mothers. To do so, I will also briefly discuss the aspects of nature and nurture in mothering, as well as the bearing this has on specifically adoptive mothering. Given the historical setting of the novel, namely the 19th century, I will use as a framework for quote unquote measuring mothering during the time the concept of the volksmoeder to analyze which of the two women in the novel, Bartha and Fiela, would have been considered a real mother during the early 1900s. Further, the issues of how mothering is racialized and classed, specifically given the socio-political and socio-economic milieu of South Africa at that time, will be discussed. I will draw on all the aforementioned concepts as I then turn to a thematic analysis of mothering in the novel itself. One cannot discuss mothering without having an understanding of how mothering is defined and by whom. Similarly, one cannot discuss adoptive mothering without investigating how and why this type of mothering troubles normative and institutionalized definitions of mothering. Randall's definition of mothering notes that mothers across social classes and races express similar beliefs that good parenting adheres to the tenets of mothering by being child-centered, time-consuming, and self-sacrificing. Not only do we need to consider that this is a particularly contemporary view of mothering, known as intensive mothering, but also that it is a largely westernized and patriarchal concept. However, SETI, in a 29 article, notes that certain interconnected roles of a woman as caregiver, nurturer, educator, protector, and learner are commonly acknowledged as integral aspects of mothering across cultures and centuries, especially within the confines of the patriarchy. Nakano Glenn notes that studies of mothering need to contend with pervasive ideologies which have shaped society's view of mothering. The assumption that it is biological and natural and is indelibly linked to a woman's ability to biologically reproduce, which is also called biological privilege. Ideologies of mothering do not exist in isolation, but as part of complex ideologies buttressed by the patriarchy. It is largely the patriarchal view of the female body as a vessel of procreation that strengthens the link between biological privilege and mothering, as patriarchal society enshrines norms defining womanhood via reproductive biology. Further, Bergenheim and Lindler note that women are perceived to have a duty to contribute to a positive demographic development and a family-friendly society through having biological children, a belief called pronatalism. Pronatalism is further defined by MacLeod et al. As the belief that motherhood is natural, a rational choice, a privilege that should not be refused, a worthwhile responsibility, and a fulfilling spiritual journey. When biological privilege, pronatalism, and patriarchal beliefs regarding mothering are combined, when a woman subscribes to the ideal that it is her role to reproduce, and that mothering is a natural and, importantly, biological process, the result is what MacLeod et al. Calls legitimate mothering, or, in essence, real mothering. One of the ways in which adoption troubles the aforementioned preconceptions about mothering, and specifically legitimate mothering, becomes clear when one investigates the concept of nature versus nurture in mothering. Novi argues that before 1920, Media represented adoptive mothers as individuals with strong, even exceptional mothering instincts. That is, the willingness and capability to nurture and care for a biologically unrelated child. It is only after 1920, Novi posits, that the view of mothering instinct in adoptive mothering changed, as the superiority of biological mothering, reinforced by the patriarchal institutionalized view of the woman's body being primarily a childbearing vessel, gained more traction in society, and pronatalism was given supremacy over non-biological means of family making. The link between nature versus nurture and mothering is one prevalent in adoption, mainly as traditional views of mothering imply that pregnancy fosters an innate mothering instinct, which adoptive parents are theorized not to possess, according to Cole et al. This is despite the fact that scholars such as Paxton note that maternal instinct is not an instinct that takes over automatically, but is rather a learned, cultivated altruism characterized by nurturing. As such, adoptive mothering troubles the concept of what society believes to be maternal instinct, as adoptive mothers contribute no nature in terms of genetic material, but do nurture the adoptive child, bringing us back to the question of whether an adoptive mother is a real mother. Leon posits that adoptive mothering is seen as not real because of the pervasive idea that reproduction is linked to the myth of maternal instinct, which he defines as a cultural belief posited on the conviction that the conception of a child endows the woman with a sense of maternal love that only pregnancy can ensure. This preconception leaves little room for the adoptive mother and her role as nurturer. Indeed, the biological privilege being absent, the adoptive mother is rendered not real. With specific reference to the novel Fiela's Child, one cannot discuss mothering in 19th century South Africa without investigating the concept of the volksmoeder, which translates to mother of the nation. The volksmoeder is described by Brink as the Afrikaans manifestation of the universal mother of the nation phenomenon. As a concept, she is womanhood idealized, a figurehead inspiring white Afrikaner women to live in service of and sacrifice everything for their folk, their nation, and their families, the cornerstone of the Afrikaner nation. As a call to arms, the concept of the volksmoeder was appropriated as an evocative and emotionally laden site of memory to which several generations of Afrikaner women readily responded, says Brink. As you can see on the screen, this is a statue called Nooitjie van die Onderveld, which was the physical embodiment of what the volksmoeder should look like. Willem Posma, under the pseudonym Dr. Oculus, writes in his 1922 tome Die Boervrou, Moeder van haar Volk, which translates to the Boer woman, mother of a nation, about the volksmoeder's virtue, her value as a housewife, her selflessness and self-reliance, and her serving as an inspiration to girls and other women to act as nurturer of the white Afrikaner nation. He describes her as being brave, honest, frugal, a hard worker, friendly and hospitable, and content with her destiny in life. Indeed, writes Brink, a volksmoeder's duty was to uplift her fellow countrymen and women, and to constantly remind each other that they could triumph over adversity, could succeed at motherhood, and would be able to resurrect the nation. They were subservient to their husbands, did not challenge authority, all the while nurturing and nourishing their families and their communities despite their own needs. The conceptualized volksmoeder ideal would come to serve as a tool of propaganda for Afrikaner nationalism for many years to come, because above all, the volksmoeder is white and she is a mother. I will later refer back to this concept in order to show the implications of this idealized mother figure on the representation of Fiela and Bartha's mothering in the novel. Furthermore, and importantly, South African mothering has, according to MacLeod et al., always been raced, classed, and gendered. This is particularly salient considering the socio-historical context of Matthee's novel, a time when heteronormative concepts regarding who is fit to reproduce based on class and race were even more prevalent than they are today. How mothering is racialized is a concept that bears further discussion. Adoption's less than salubrious history shows many instances of children being forcibly removed from and ostensibly relinquished by indigenous mothers to more suitable, read white, families. This practice was common in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and North America, where mostly unwed First Nations, Aboriginal, Maori, or Native American mothers were forced to give their children up for adoption to white families. In Canada and Australia, some children were also sent to residential schools or similar institutions, which were administered by Christian organizations. In Hanson's words, such institutions had, quote, the nominal objective of educating Indigenous children, but also the more damaging and equally explicit objectives of indoctrinating them into westernized and Christian ways of living and assimilating them into mainstream white society, end quote. This aspect was further bolstered by the notion that Indigenous peoples could not raise their children properly, spurred on by racist agendas propounded by the white inhabitants of the aforementioned countries. The reasoning behind this was that it would either force Indigenous people to assimilate with white communities, rendering them appropriate enough to enter white communities and work as laborers, or that they would preferably distance and separate themselves from white communities, according to Nogrady. However, their children were to be raised white, so as to facilitate integration into white communities and accept Christian doctrine as their own. This also goes to show how mothering is classed, with those of lower stature considered incapable of providing for a child. Racialized and classed mothering come into play in Fiela's child in that Fiela's race precludes her from being Benjamin's real mother, while Barta's does not, despite the fact that Fiela is considered to be of a slightly higher social standing than Barta. The racialization of mothering, therefore, seems to weigh more heavily than the classing thereof when judgments regarding legitimate mothering are made. In society at large, being an adoptive mother has long been seen as the second best option, as opposed to having a biological child. It has indeed recently taken an even lower position in the matrix of family formation preferences, says Bell, behind kinship resulting from medical treatments such as in vitro fertilization. As far back as 1995, Bartolet noted that society's status quo is profoundly anti-adoption and pro-natalist, largely attributed to the perceived superiority of genetic ties between mother and child, or biological privilege. According to Greenway, adoption troubles the boundaries of reproduction, reveals cultural anxiety surrounding the idea of maternal desire, and thereby invites transgressions of the definitions and boundaries of motherhood. When we take all of this into consideration, it seems that the opposite of a real or legitimate mother is an adoptive mother. As noted by Schultz, adoptive mothers are deemed defective due to their implied or assumed infertility, and thus are not real mothers, ultimately resulting in the othering of such mothers. I now turn to a thematic analysis of mothering in relation to Fiela's child. Pictured here is a brief overview of the family structures of Benjamin/Lucas's adopted families. It is important to note before we start the discussion that Barta is not Benjamin/Lucas's biological mother. She is aware of this fact. In the magistrate's court, where she is asked to identify him, she does pick him out of a lineup. However, it only much later becomes apparent that she was told by one of the census workers that she should identify him as her son. He could not live with a colored family, the man said. It is better for the child to live among his own people, believing the lie that the Van Rooyens are his parents, than for him, a white child, to live with a colored family. Another caveat I need to add here is that how these women are narrated contribute to how they are perceived by the reader. Fiela's character is narrated in the first person. Her traits, actions, thoughts, and mothering are represented in her own words as told by her, of her. On the other hand, Bartha is depicted through the eyes of others. Mostly we see Bartha through the eyes of her husband Elias, but we also glimpse her as she is seen by Benjamin Lucas. This adds another dimension to the question of real and unreal mothering. Can we truly base our assumptions of Bartha's mothering on others' perceptions of her? Similarly, even though Fiela's character is narrated in the first person, we need to be aware that she is still depicted by the author. Neither Bartha nor Fiela are historical figures who really existed, but are narrativized versions of mothers. We can therefore only base our perceptions of their mothering on the information we, as readers, are allowed to see. As life imitates art, we can similarly not draw conclusions about real versus unreal mothering based on what we see when we look at biological and adopted families. Though Matthee might not have intended to address this in her novel, it is nonetheless an important observation in relation to the topic under discussion. As a colored woman, Fiela Kumuti would not be considered a volksmoeder based solely on her race. However, let us return to Ocullus's criteria for the volksmoeder in order to see how Fiela would measure up to this ideal should she have been white. A reminder that Ocullus defines the volksmoeder as brave, honest, frugal, a hard worker, friendly and hospitable, and content with her destiny in life, selfless and self-reliant, and subservient to her husband. Fiela is a landowner, a subsistence farmer who is shown to be frugal, a savvy nurturer for her husband and children. Her family is clothed in sturdy, clean outfits. They have good hygiene and enough to eat. She is shown to be a hard worker, a woman who provides for her family. One way in which she does not play to the volksmoeder trope, however, is in her interactions with men, who she vocally challenges when they are perceived to intrude on her rights. A salient example of this is when Fiela journeys to Neisnacht twice to find out what happened to Benjamin when he does not return to Wolvekraal after being removed by the census workers. She does not shy away from challenging first a clerk and later the magistrate himself to question how and why Benjamin was sent to live with the Van Rooyens. Similarly, she challenges the census takers who question whether she is Benjamin's mother. Her husband, Seling, is also a supporting character rather than a patriarchal overlord. Fiela's volksmoeder, if we can call her that, is not subservient to her husband. Apart from this aspect of Fiela's character, however, she does meet the overall criteria of Ocullus's volksmoeder. However, she is discredited as a volksmoeder simply because all these attributes only fall under that category when they are cultivated in service of the white Afrikaner race. Thank you, Tinus, for that observation. Fiela Kumuti is already a mother to her biological children when she takes Benjamin in and raises him as her handchild. She is described as a nurturer, a matriarch, financially independent, well known in her community, and a caring mother to her children. She, when the census takers, when the census takers come to take Benjamin away, Fiela does not treat the situation with passive resistance, but remains proactive. As the peace breakers, as Fiela calls them, tell her that the magistrate wishes to see the child, she makes the resolute decision that her child will not meet white people and live up to the stereotype of the supposedly backwards, impoverished colored people he grew up with. Her family is mustered to gather wood for a fire, water for a bath, soap and clean clothes, because as Fiela notes, we don't want him ashamed of us. She also gives him money so he can prove to the white people that he is not raised in poverty. Fiela sets out to challenge normative views regarding colored people at the time. It is important to note that Fiela is proactive, that she does not retreat into fear, at least on the surface, because she has decided to believe that Benjamin will be returned to her, as the census takers promise. When Lucas does not return from Knysna, Fiela does not hesitate, as discussed before, to take on the long, arduous journey from her home to Knysna through the Long Kloof. Despite the unsatisfactory outcome of both these confrontations, where she is told that Benjamin is sent to live with his real family, Fiela is shown to be willing to take on the dangers in order to look for Benjamin and bring him home. Through these depictions, we come to see how Fiela's mothering is racialized, and here I'm referring to her interactions with the clerk and the magistrate. The white man's insistence that she cannot be Benjamin's real mother because he is white and she is colored speaks to the institutional racism that is still prevalent in South Africa to this day. This situation urges Fiela to ask her white neighbor, Petrus Zondag, for help. When telling Petrus that Benjamin was taken away, Petrus notes that Benjamin's removal from Fiela's care was inevitable as he was a foundling. In his words, Fiela recognizes how her mothering is raced and says, "Say what you mean. Say, because Benjamin is a white foundling. If he had been like us, no one would have said a word about it." Petrus promises to speak to the magistrate himself. A white man would certainly have more authority, would be given answers to the questions, would be able to find out where Benjamin was, unlike a colored woman. Yet upon Petrus's return, no good news is to be had. He has spoken to the magistrate, and Benjamin would not return to Wolvekraal. In what Fiela considers an act of utter betrayal, Petrus believes and reiterates all that the magistrate had said. Benjamin was happy with his own family. He was healthy and doing well, as was attested by a forester who looked in on the family. The language Petrus uses to explain why Benjamin would not return is raced, clearly showing Fiela that her mothering, though good, did not bridge the chasm between races. As he says, the forest couple are his rightful parents. The child is back with his people. You would not have been able to keep him much longer. He is white. Through the sheer act of Fiela's mothering being razed, her position as Benjamin's mother had been revoked, her child lost to her based on patriarchal, white legal system that would not allow a white child to live in a colored home. Fiela realizes that she is powerless before the law and the decision that was made in the supposed best interest of her child. As fiercely as she feels that she is Benjamin's mother, she is powerless. She does not know and will not be told where Benjamin is, and she can now only be his mother in thought. Throughout the novel, Matthee continues to depict Fiela as a concerned and caring mother, despite Benjamin's absence. She remains the embodiment of female and maternal strength, evidenced through her strict, matriarchal running of her household, Celine's gentle subservience, and her pride. Fiela is depicted as a dialectical being, in constant shifting conversation with herself, others, and the systems of power she has to negotiate for survival. As a colored woman, she moves between the traditional maternal stereotypes of white and black cultures, dismantling and problematizing the concept of mothering. The very fact that the novel presents a rearranged matrilineal genealogical system, disruptive of the patriarchal system, is significant. Fiela is depicted as a matriarch and originator of new lines of descent. She disrupts the normative power relationships and their associated discourses, and rewrites history by means of the ways they manage the relationship that exists between her and Benjamin, between mother and son. In Fiela's Child, there is a many-layered paradox involved in this, since firstly, Benjamin's true origins are and will forever be unknown. He could thus, in effect, be of any racial or ethnic background. As such, Fiela can also be read as endangering the mythologized ideal of the white Afrikaner family and mother, since she threatens to expose the disjunction between this myth and a material reality that is more diverse and complicated. Thanks again, Tinus. Her status as Benjamin's mother seems to be cemented when he decides to return to Wolwekraal, calling Fiela his mother. In short, Fiela's status as real mother cannot be contested when measured against the concept of Ocullus's volksmoeder. Even as an adoptive mother, Fiela adheres to most of these criteria. It is solely by virtue of her race that she is not seen as a legitimate mother to Benjamin. The question as to whether Fiela is Benjamin's real mother cannot be conclusively answered. The concept of the real is too ethereal to be pinned down in such a way it cannot be quantified or measured. The best answer to this question is perhaps Benjamin's assertion that Fiela always has been and remains his real mother. Again, using Ocullus's criteria of what the volksmoeder embodies, I now turn to the discussion of Bartha van Rooyen. In contrast to Matthee's depiction of Fiela, Bartha does not meet most of these criteria. As far as subservience to her husband goes, however, she does conform. As opposed to Seling and Fiela, Bartha's husband, Elias, rules with an iron hand, and Bartha makes for a frail, cowed figure, silenced in every aspect of her being. Elias's savage beatings and verbal abuse, his treatment of Bartha as, for all intents and purposes, an enslaved housekeeper, serve to keep her in her place as a woman in the patriarchal system. As for the other of Ocullus's criteria, however, Bartha's children are dirty and unkempt. Her daughter Nina roams the forest dressed in rags, her hair an untamed bird's nest. She does not help her mother with household chores and is largely left to her own devices. Often, her mother doesn't know where she is, which is even more salient when considering that one of Bartha's children, Lucas, had already gone missing. Unlike the idealized volksmoeder, who raises her daughter to follow in her self-sacrificial and subservient footsteps, Bartha seems incapable of keeping track of her daughter. The family struggles with food insecurity, with Bartha having to rely on what the forest and their meager plantings have to offer to feed her family. Even had Bartha wanted to espouse the ideal of the volksmoeder, it would have been nigh on impossible. Her decrepit living conditions, the physical and mental abuse from her husband, the oppressive patriarchal society she lives in, her poverty, all combine to render her physically, mentally, and verbally unable to fulfill this role. Bartha is, in fact, not a matriarchal figure at all, but rather a shadow of a woman barely inhabiting a space in her family. Matthee further depicts Bartha as a passive victim of her marriage and her circumstances. The important term here is depicted. Whereas we get to see Fiela through first-person narration, Bartha is mostly narrated through the eyes of others, especially her husband Elias. This is not to say that Bartha is treated unsympathetically. In fact, the reader is allowed a close-up view of the milieu that shaped her. However, the disappearance of her son Lucas seems unsurprising, as Bartha is depicted as having a detached approach to watching her children and keeping track of their whereabouts. It is interesting that the novel notes, when you grew up in the forest, you knew what awaited a child that wandered from a footpath, when there was no one with him. When the fog closed in, you kept your child in the house. Yet Lucas was not supervised or in the house when the fog came down. However, not living up to what nowadays would be called intensive mothering does not mean that Bartha is not deeply affected by the disappearance of her child. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, Fiela's loss of Benjamin sees her being proactive, taking charge of the situation, Bartha becomes background noise during the loss of her son. She is described as being old, forlorn, dressed in black, and needing to be physically supported by other women. This description serves to paint for the reader a picture of Bartha that stands in contrast to Fiela. Though one might posit that this is due to her marital and social circumstances, we need to keep in mind that Matthee may already be laying the groundwork for narrating Bartha as an inept mother. Unlike chapters centering on Fiela, where we hear Fiela's voice and internal dialogue, our first impressions of Bartha are shaped through her husband's comments. In his eyes, she constantly complains, is idle, has no food to put on the table, asks too many questions, and cannot take care of their children. It is clear that Elias sees his wife as a burden, not doing her part in his mind for looking after the family. During Bartha and Elias's journey to Naisna to go and identify Lucas, he again continues his negative description of Bartha. She walks too slowly. She complains, and it is her fault that they had to start walking to Naisna at 4 o'clock in the morning because she did not want to sleep over in Naisna on the way. We could posit that Matthee chooses to do this as to emphasize Bartha's subservience to her husband, and how Elias's depictions as head of the household, to a large extent, gives way to the representation of Bartha as insecure and inept. As they journey to Naisna, Bartha voices her doubts regarding that the boy they are to identify being Lucas, repeatedly asking Elias whether he thinks she would recognize him. Elias is unconcerned. Should they not recognize the child, they will merely return home. It is a common theme in his conversations with Bartha during their journey, where she constantly expresses the fear that she will not recognize the child. This is quite understandable. After so many years, would the boy she sees even resemble the one she lost? And if she did not recognize him, but he was Lucas, what would happen to him if he was left behind? Her recollection of Lucas seems vague. She further expresses doubts as to how the child could have arrived in the Karoo after traversing the Long Kloof. However, her uncertainty is silenced. Elias wants the matter resolved so they can return home, hopefully with a boy who can help him earn more money. It is as if he has already decided that Lucas, or the boy they are to identify, is their missing child, all the way silencing Bartha's realistic and relevant concerns. Also, when needing to identify her lost son, is Bartha silenced. She is explicitly told by the census taker to say that the boy in the blue shirt, standing amid a group of other boys, is her son, despite her misgivings. Her behavior in court speaks to how she has been conditioned, perhaps by her marital or socio-economic circumstances, or by the patriarchal Afrikaner prescriptions of how a woman should behave, to abide by what men tells her to do. She scarcely looks at the boy, but points at him before bursting into tears. One might speculate as to the reason for her crying, perhaps because she is so anxious about appearing before the magistrate, perhaps because she comes to the realization that her son, Lucas, will never return, or perhaps because she is aware that the boy she has pointed to is not her son. Whatever the case may be, Bartha is seen to intercede between Elias and Lucas whenever the former deems his son to be uncooperative or defiant. She is the one who placates Elias by assuring him that Lucas only needs to get used to them, their home, and their siblings before he stops screaming in his sleep, refusing to talk to the Van Rooyens, and staying away from his family. We further see Bartha's mothering through the eyes of Lucas, who describes her as sad and frightened. Little does he know the emotional turmoil behind her outward appearance. On the one hand, she is guilt-ridden for having identified the boy as her lost son, while knowing it is not him. On the other hand, she lives in fear of the magistrate coming to visit and removing him from their abusive, poor, squalid community. She is also scared of Elias's ire towards the boy, knowing that a beating is likely imminent. Lucas keeps himself apart from the family, wakes up screaming during the night, and still calls Elias master. Bartha keeps explaining this away and apologizing for this behavior, but Elias seems to have reached the end of his patience. Bertha continues to be portrayed as being needlessly anxious, inept in her housekeeping, unsatisfied with Elias's provision for the family, and in fact, stupid, as you can see in the quotes on the screen. Though Bertha's responses to Elias's critique of her child, sorry, through Bertha's responses to Elias's critique of her child rearing, we come to see that Bertha cares for her children. When Elias complains that Nina does no work and that she should not run wild in the forest, Bertha explained that she is a child and should be allowed to play. Carrying on his vitriolic rant about Lucas being oppositional, Bertha again steps in for the child. Though perhaps not allowed to show affection physically or verbally, or perhaps being unable to convey it to her children, Bertha is someone who stands up for her children, though not in the way we see Fiela do. Continuing in the vein that Bertha is narrated by other characters rather than through the first person, Lucas notes that Bertha always looks sad and that she often stares at him, quickly looking away when he meets her gaze. Little is he to know that she is very much aware that he is not their son, Lucas. Excuse me, I just want to check. Okay, sorry. Bertha is not a dialectic figure in this novel. We are not allowed, we are allowed only limited glimpses of her interactions with others and are not given access to her internal dialogue or thought processes. She is not seen to challenge the system of the patriarchy, but is depicted as an unwitting victim of her circumstances. As far as the ideal of the volksmoeder goes, Bertha certainly does not meet most of the criteria. However, her race alone, again, renders her a suitable mother to her adopted, declared biological child. Though Lucas does take to calling her Ma, it is not because he feels kinship with her, but because not doing so enrages Elias and incurs merciless beatings. Lucas is often seen to question how Bertha could be his biological mother. He seems incapable of grasping how someone like him could be biologically related to someone like her. It is only after Bertha's eventual revelation that she had lied in court, that she had been coerced into adopting Lucas, that she finally finds her voice and releases Lucas from his same-race adoption. By virtue of her race, Bertha is appointed Lucas's mother, his real mother, even though a biological link between them can be proved as little as one between Lucas and Fiela. In essence, the novel shows how mothering is questioned based on the concept of race. Aspects of mothering identified as being acknowledged across cultures and races, as I discussed earlier, are not considered in the placement with this child with an adoptive family. This further links to the larger debate in adoption studies regarding the placement of adoptees with same-race families. A common theme in adoption literature surrounding interracial adoption is that a child adopted into a family of a different race faces racism, alienation from both their birth and adopted families and their peers, unfamiliarity with their cultures of birth, and identity crises, according to Godon, Dicoteau, and Ramsey. Certainly in the South African milieu during which Fiela's child is set, the focus was also on placing children with same-race families, but arguably this was based more on the aspect of racial segregation than on it being in the child's best interest. In fact, and again I thank Tinus for his input here, these two aspects were constructed as synonymous. In other words, under the political regime of the 19th century, it was held as common sense that children's interests are served by placing them in families that match their presumably natural biological race. This creates a clear link to biological racial essentialism and the inferred assumption that mothers and children are servants and bearers of the well-being of their race. With Bertha's confession to Benjamin now complete, with her adopted son hearing how she stripped him of Lucas van Rooyen, we return to the question, who is his real mother. At this point, and after much soul-searching, he decides to call himself once again Benjamin Kumuti and to return to Fiela in the Long Kloof. This is perhaps not surprising, as throughout the novel he continues to refer to Fiela as his mother. With Benjamin's acceptance of Fiela as his real mother, the reader comes to accept this too. However, this seems a rather neat solution to what remains the central question of this paper. What makes a mother real? Whose child are you then? Nina asks Lucas towards the end of the novel. A rephrasing of the question, are you the child's real mother? Based on the presumptive classifications of mothering I discussed at the start of the paper, the question of what a real mother is remains unanswered. It is not a question I think could ever be answered given the vagueness and subjectivity of the term real. If we were to use the framework of the Volksmoeder to gauge real mothering, if mothering were quantifiable, if O'Cullis's criteria provides us with a checklist of what being a real mother during the 19th century entails, the answer is clear. Fiela is Benjamin's real mother. However, based on race alone, the social-political milieu in which the novel is set precludes Fiela from being so, and it is up to Benjamin, after years of lies and abuse, to make the final ruling. If we similarly define mothering based on the patriarchal, institutionalized concepts of biological privilege and pronatalism, which espouses the superiority of biological parenting, neither Fiela nor Bartha would qualify as his real mother. Nakano Glenn posits that mothering has been and continues to be defined in terms of binary oppositions between male, female, nature, nurture, biological, non-biological, and so on. Mothering has been assigned to the subordinate poles of these oppositions. Thus, it is viewed as flowing from natural female attributes, located only in the private sphere of family and involving strong emotional attachment and altruistic motives. Critical analysis of mothering requires deconstructing these oppositions. Mothering has been and continues to be contested terrain, and as long as the pronatalist approach to mothering is espoused, alternative means of family making will remain to be seen as deviant, inferior, and mothers in such families as not real. Adoption challenges dominant essentialist discourses on mothering, as perhaps it should, to bring alternative constructions of mothering into the spotlight. Mothering occurs within specific social contexts that vary in terms of material and cultural resources and constraints. How mothering is conceived, organized, and carried out is not simply determined by these conditions, however. Mothering is constructed through men's and women's actions within specific historical circumstances. As long as variations of mothering exists, it confirms that the concept of mothering is socially constructed, not biologically inscribed. Towards a redefinition of mothering, it is perhaps prudent to start looking at mothering as a historically and culturally variable relationship in which one individual nurtures and cares for another. Until then, it seems that mothering may continue to be classified as either being real or not. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hanta, for this very fascinating and I think very thought-provoking paper. It now seems to me that the silence, especially in literary and cultural studies, about this topic on adoptionalities is actually echoing, and so I think we should congratulate you for blazing the trails on this subject and topic. Let me now invite questions and comments and criticisms for Hanta. You can just raise your hand or just unmute yourself and talk to Hanta.
Does nobody want to talk to me?
Well, while we wait for colleagues to talk to you, Hanta, I well, obviously, as you stated in your biography, this is part of your broader research work. I was wondering, how big is the corpus on adoptive narratives in South Africa?
That's a good question, Oliver. This is a corpus that is continuously evolving and expanding. In my PhD, I look at only three. I look at Fiela's Child and then two others, but they have recently come onto the market quite a few other works on adoption, mainly fictional accounts. Um, But what started my interest in this field is that when we adopted our children, I realized that the parenting community in general is not really very welcoming to adoptive parents. And I wondered where adoptive parents could start looking for a sense of, you know, community and kinship and belonging. And I theorize that adoption narratives can potentially create that space for us. And I mean, that has developed into also seeing it as a space where adoptees and biological parents can find a sense of kinship and community. So there is quite a lot of literature um, that are adoption narratives. However, in South Africa, that pool is not as big as it is globally. Not a lot of writing is done about adoption and specifically interracial adoption in South Africa, although there are quite a few works. I hope that answers your question.
It does. It does. Thanks so much. Um, no hands still. Yes, HMVE Combrick.
Hi, Mike. Mike, we can see you, but we can't hear you.
Yes, perhaps while Mike is sorting out his microphone, we can hear from Tina.
Hi, yes. So as I was listening, I realized that this sounds a bit familiar. I think I attended this series where a similar topic was being addressed, and I'm not sure if it was you or if it was someone else, but what I wanted to find out, I guess, is are they related? Um, is it a build up or? But it does really sound familiar. Unfortunately, today I could not follow as well because I'm struggling with network. But this is a topic that interests me. So I wanted to find out if um, today's conversation was related or a build up from that previous one. I think that one was last year.
Hi, Tina. Yes, I did speak on National Adoption Awareness Month last year, um, where I also broached the topic of real and not real mothering. Um, this is one of the central themes in my research. So also when I looked at the year before that at the adoption memoir, Killing Caroline, I also discussed this theme. So it really does build on each other. I mean, it's kind of different building blocks in the study of adoption narratives. Um, and the thing is, the more I write about it, the more I discover, and the more points of view there are to consider. As I said, I mean, I started out looking at this from purely the point of view of the adoptive parent, but there are so many other parties that you need to take into consideration. And what's also important is that the role of mothering is not only questioned by society, but within adoption studies, it's also questioned by adoptees who ask the question, should I accept as a mother the woman who basically ripped me away from my biological mother and my biological heritage? So this is quite a common theme in adoption studies, I think. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope so.
Yes, I hope it does. Perhaps we can go back to Mike. Um,
I hope I'm audible now.
yes, you are now.
Yes.
It's actually hilarious, Mike, with a problem with his microphone. Um, that said, thank you very much for the presentation. I think it just like it was with the previous talk that you had given, which was about a different topic but related to the same problem. I'm quite curious and quite interested. You made a lot of reference to social constructs about the general perception that people have towards adoption, the general perception people shared, given the discourse that you analyzed, of what may or may not have been what we can consider a historic artifact. What I'm quite interested in and curious about is, are you open to the idea of generating or potentially looking at social media conversations between people in, let's say, on a variety of different digital spaces when they engage in adoption, to see what the general perceptions are? And would that type of work benefit or strengthen or augment the work that you do? So I guess what I'm asking is, would you be interested in finding out what people are talking about in social spaces related to adoption, and whether or not these perceptions reinforce these historic accounts, like the discourse analysis that you had done, and other bodies, given that they are limited corpus?
That's a very good question, Mike. Thank you. I don't focus on that aspect in my PhD specifically, but it is definitely of interest to me. I do follow quite a few social media um, groups that is involved in adoption. Actually, one of them is called, I think, Changing the Adoption Narrative, which I think is a very salient name, actually. Um, Specifically, a lot of the groups focus on the sense of loss and displacement felt by adoptees. What is problematic is that most of these groups are in Europe and North America. So it doesn't necessarily speak to the South African adoption experience. However, it does raise many concerns regarding identity, especially in the global north. As in the global north, many adoptions were and still continue to be closed adoptions, where the adoptees' birth records and medical records are withheld from them, and they have no idea who their biological parents are. They are not allowed to contact their biological parents, and um, in many cases, the adoptive parents also don't tell these children that they are adopted. Um, Apart now from in interracial adoption, where it's kind of unavoidable. So a very interesting thing is that there's a documentary called Closure. It was made in 2013 by Angela Tucker, who is an adoptee, about the search for her biological parents. And she has since started a blog where she specifically um, interviews adoptees and adoptive parents and biological parents. And things like this, and as well as you say, the conversations on digital platforms, certainly does add a whole other dimension to the study of adoption, especially because research shows us that members of the adoption triangle are often silenced. They are not, or let me rather say, they are expected not to speak out about the trauma, but rather to present this image of being grateful for adoption. And I have referred to this before as the cult of gratitude that it's inherent in adoption. So absolutely, I am more than willing to look at more of these digital conversations, perhaps create a corpus out of these digital conversations. I'm just concerned about how I would connect that to the South African context, because there really aren't many discussions in this vein in the South African context. It is more in the context of the global north. I hope that gives you your answer.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Thinas.
Hello, Hunter. Thanks so much for what was definitely to me a stimulating presentation. I enjoyed listening to this very much. I've got a quick question about Fiela's child. As you have mentioned before, one of the complications in the whole adoption triangle is that adoptive parents are susceptible to the accusation from the adopted child and from various other parties that they have extracted a child from what others might consider their real culture. They've stolen the child, or they have somehow disconnected a child from their culture or from their biological parents. So there's a way in which I wonder whether the novel Fiela's Child has anything to say about that issue, because Fiela herself has very little choice, I suppose, to adopt Benjamin at the start. I mean, a child is left on her doorstep. She can either let it die or she can take it in. So that's my question. Do you think this novel has anything to say about the charge that is often laid against adoptive parents? I mean, surely no novel can speak about everything, but do you think this novel has anything to say about that issue, or should we not look for any comment on that issue in this novel at all?
That's a good question, Dennis. And I think in your and Eileen's feedback on my chapter on this topic, this is actually also something that you raised, or that I raised actually, when I said that this is not traditionally an adoption narrative. So I am not sure whether we could expect this novel to comment on issues such as this. However, characters in the novel do make reference to what you mention in certain ways. For example, the white census takers do tell Fiela things like Benjamin should be raised among his own people. You are taking him away from his own, I don't know what you call it, roots, his white roots. Um, and I think we can see this also in the magistrate's comment when he says that he now lives with his own people. However, for me, this is not as much a concern about him being taken out of his culture or stolen as it is about the racial discrimination, that a brown woman cannot raise a white child. It is illegal. From Benjamin, or when he's called Lucas's perspective, we certainly do see commentary on the fact that he feels that he was stolen from what he sees as his culture, which is Fiela's culture, the colored culture. He absolutely comments on things like um, the Van Rooyens are, they are, he keeps calling them strange. He keeps making comments like they are unkempt, they are slovenly, they are dirty. He doesn't associate with this culture. He doesn't associate with the culture where children are used as laborers, where women are beaten and abused, where there is no food. I think to him it's actually a culture shock to go into the white community, which is supposed to be his culture. So I think mostly this question that you have is addressed by these comments by Lucas or Benjamin, and then also the comments that the magistrate and the census takers make to Fiela. But in general, I don't feel that this is really a golden thread that runs through the novel. And as I said, as it isn't really considered an adoption novel, I'm not sure that we could expect this novel to deal with this as well. I hope that answers you.
Yes, thanks, Tinas. Do we have any further questions, any further comments for Hanta? Mike, is that a new hand or a legacy one?
It's a new hand, Prof.
Yes, yes. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Throughout the presentation, you did make reference to the idea that there are multiple problems. Obviously, there's a lack of information in our context as one problem, but also a lack of awareness. Now, I know that for the purpose of the PhD, as you have mentioned before, that your focus is on exploring and understanding adoption narratives in the southern context a lot more. However, I was just thinking, and I'm just curious, would you be open to studies that are related to prompting awareness in this domain? So rather than just, I'm not saying just, but rather than exploring what the current narratives are you open to particular studies that relate to raising awareness in some way, shape, or form? Thank you.
Absolutely. Mike, what you are talking about relates to what is called in the literature the narrative burden of the adoption triangle, where the adoption narrative is often twisted or distorted, especially by representations in popular media. And so adoptees have actually started taking it upon themselves to say, the adoption story is my story, and I should be telling my story. And because, as you say, there is a lot of, well, there is not a lot of information and awareness, there's a big lack of it. It kind of comes down to the adoption triangle to become, what's the word I'm looking for? Spokespeople for adoption, to inform, to create awareness. And I hope that my research, and not just my PhD, but the research in general, can in some way address this aspect, because especially in terms of South Africa, there's a lot of ignorance and superstition related to adoption that also has to do with cultural and racial um, lines between mostly biological and adoptive families, but also internationally. I think there is a large misconception about adoption. There is a lack of awareness, there is a lack of information. And I really think that things like celebrity adoptions and popular media have a very big role to play in this, in the way that they continue to represent adoption. For example, briefly that adoptees are represented as being difficult, that they have emotional problems, that they have physical problems, that adoptive parents are represented as being white and affluent, that biological parents are represented as being having troubled backgrounds, as not caring for the biological child. So absolutely creating awareness is what I hope will be an outcome of this research.
Thank you. Any further questions?
I see that Nomslansla's hand is up.
Oh, yes.
Good afternoon, Hanta and everyone. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, Hanta. I remember this is part of the work that you actually presented last year. I'm thinking out loud. The about the relationship between the adopted parents, the adoptee, and the quote unquote backlash. I'm wondering if you could actually, I could perhaps look at racial entanglements. Basically, I think perceived race and perceived privilege in this kind of as a catalyst for this kind of tensions. And also wondering if you could also perhaps enrich the study by looking at narratives of adoption within the sphere of African literature. We have a lot of those. Of course, they do not speak to the question of race and privilege, but there are tensions that we actually find there. But also, as you mentioned, the voice of the adopted child is usually silent. And if it does appear, it's usually in a chapter or two. I don't know if that is a question or comment.
Nomslanshla, I agree with you. Though it wasn't necessarily the focus of this paper, it definitely is important to look at this. The thing of perceived race and perceived privilege absolutely comes into play. As I said, where adoptive parents are usually represented as white and affluent, they come from the position where they are privileged enough to adopt a child. Whereas if we look at kin adoption, where family members take in, for example, orphan children, that does not come from a position of privilege, but rather from a position of, shall I say, obligation, if I can put it that way. So absolutely investigating how these issues are represented and navigated in adoption narratives is very important, specifically in African literature. And I've only recently come across a book that Helene made me aware of that specifically speaks to mothering in African texts. However, there's extremely limited research on this specific topic. And that is also something that I hope I can continue to explore in my future research. Thank you for your comment.
Thanks so much, Hanta. I think we are almost at the end of the seminar. This leads me to thank you, Hanta, for breaking the ground for this year's seminar series. And what a way to do it than this wonderful, wonderful paper. We should wish you the best for this paper as a paper and also as a broader study. Yes, I think we should end it here. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Enjoy what's left of the day and the week. We should regather in the next 2 weeks where Philip will give us a talk. Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
so
Bye.
much. Thanks for chairing, Oliver, and thank you everyone for coming to listen.
Thanks, Hanta.